Thank you, Josh. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers Beyond Borders, the first program for this year. Thank you for being here. My name is Surabhi Kaushik. I am a writer, a library volunteer, and a literary artist. Apart from writing, I enjoy putting together programs like this, both virtually and in person, because I think that they help to build a supportive and a nourishing community. And I'm happy to welcome my good friend, Sarah Archer, to this program. I'm going to just read her bio out here. Sarah Archer's debut novel, The Plus One, was published by Putnam. Sorry, I'm having a technical glitch. Sarah Archer's debut novel, The Plus One, was published by Putnam in the US and received a starred review from Booklist. It has also been published in the UK, Germany, and Japan, and is currently in development for television. As a screenwriter, she has developed material for MTV Entertainment, Snapchat, and Comedy Central. She is a Blacklist Screenwriting Lab Fellow who has placed in competitions including the Motion Picture Academy's Nicole Fellowship and the Tracking Board's Launchpad. Her short stories and poetry have been published in numerous literary magazines, and she has spoken and taught writing to groups in several states and countries. And she's also the co-host of Charlotte Readers podcast. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for being here with us, and it's over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Surabhi, and thank you for everyone for being here. I'm super excited to see you and to talk to you about screenwriting today. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my notes for myself on my screen. So I might not be able to see the Zoom screen, but if you need me, just one of the admins can go off mute and give me a shout. But I might not see what's in the chat while I'm talking. So we're going to talk about screenwriting today. I'm assuming most of you here, and I know some of you are writers, but maybe not as many of you have done screenwriting, since that tends to be less common. Probably more fiction, novels, short stories, poetry, memoir, nonfiction, that sort of thing. So the approach I want to take today is to talk about screenwriting kind of from the perspective of, if this is something that you want to try, maybe you've done other sorts of writing and you're interested in trying screenwriting, or what are some of the skills that you can develop as a screenwriter, which you can then translate into your other forms of writing as well. Or maybe if you've done some screenwriting, what are some things you can do to continue to develop your craft? So I'm going to talk about things at a pretty high level, just because we don't have a ton of time, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and then we'll have some time afterwards for questions. There's also a handout that I put out that I believe the library is going to send after this, which will have some links to further resources that you can use as well. So I want to talk first about screenwriting a little bit as a creative form, kind of what it's like as an art form, what the actual writing is like. Then say you do feel inspired and you decide you want to go ahead and give it a try and do some screenwriting. Where do you start? So we'll talk a little bit about some tools and some resources that you can use to get yourself started, or things that you can continue to use to develop your writing if you're already doing some screenwriting. And then at the end, I'll briefly address where do you go from there. So if you've written a script, what can you do with it? What are some ways that you can potentially get your work produced or get work as a screenwriter? And then, like I said, we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about screenwriting just as a form of writing. What kind of distinguishes it from other types of writing? What sorts of skills does it call upon as a writer? So film and TV, first and foremost, are a visual medium. So one thing that screenwriting really pushes you to do is to show, not tell. And that's a phrase that if you're a writer, you've probably heard before, that idea of show, don't tell. It's something that a lot of writers talk about and kind of push themselves to do. And basically the idea is that you want to demonstrate things to the reader. You want to put things into the scene, put them into the actions, the visuals, the dialogue, the details, as opposed to just kind of telling the reader outright what a character is thinking or feeling, what's motivating them, kind of what happens from one point to the next. A really, really simple example would be, as opposed to telling the reader that a character is happy, you can say that the character smiles. So you're showing the emotion through an expression, a gesture instead. And generally that's thought to be a good practice just because it kind of makes things more real and immersive for the reader, as opposed to just kind of telling them things in a more overt way. It allows for more subtext. If you're writing prose, most of the time, writers will often kind of push themselves to show and not tell, but it's not necessarily a bad thing to tell when you're writing a book. sometimes it's helpful to just expedite things and to kind of communicate information in the most concise way possible. So a lot of writers will aim for sort of a balance between showing and telling, or summary and scene when they're doing prose. But if you're writing a screenplay, you don't really have that choice. You have to show as opposed to tell, because you don't have the ability to talk directly to your reader the way that you can on the page. Voiceover is kind of an exception to that. Like, you can have a character talking directly to the audience, and they could potentially say exactly what they're thinking or just explain backstory to the audience. But most of the time in a script, you're not going to have voiceover. And if you do use it, you want to be careful that you're not letting it be a crutch to just allow yourself to sort of tell things. So screenwriting really pushes you to find ways to put everything into the visuals, the actions, the dialogue, the sounds that you're hearing, the music, anything that you want to communicate to your audience, you have to figure out a way to show it. So if you want to work on that skill, screenwriting is a great way to exercise that and to push yourself to think about those things. And as I mentioned, one of the tools that you can use to show things in a screenplay is the dialogue. You can use the dialogue to push the story forward and communicate story. You can use it to characterize your characters and to help show us something about their personality. Do these characters have different voices from each other? Do their voices tell us something about where they're from, or the time and place that they live in, sort of the way that they're thinking? So if you enjoy writing dialogue, if you feel like that's something that you have a knack for, screenwriting might be a great fit for you. Or if you just want to kind of practice it and develop those skills, then screenwriting is a good exercise for that, because you're going to be writing a lot of dialogue in a screenplay. And it's important with your dialogue in a screenplay to think about how is it pushing the story forward, and also how is it telling us about character, but how is it doing those things in a way that hopefully feels still natural. So you don't want to communicate your story in a way that feels forced through the dialogue or on the nose, or like you're trying to force exposition into those scenes. Like, for instance, you wouldn't want us to necessarily have two characters who are talking and one of them says to the other, like, as you know, John, when we used to go to school together, we would go to this library a lot. Like, that's something that's clearly being told for the audience's benefit, as opposed to something that those characters would naturally say to each other in that moment. So you have to kind of push yourself to think about, how do I make it all organic? How do I submerge the storytelling that I'm trying to do into the dialogue in a way that still feels like this is what these characters would naturally be saying to each other in that moment? So that's a skill that screenwriting really pushes you to develop. Another thing about screenwriting that distinguishes it as a creative form is it's very, very story, plot, structure based. I wouldn't say that screenwriting overall is easier than fiction. I think that they each have their own challenges that they call upon you to face, but I think that in many ways you're doing less work as a screenwriter than as a novelist or as somebody writing a nonfiction book. If you think about an author publishing a book, the author is kind of like a one-man or one-woman show. You know, there might be a developmental editor, a copy editor, a cover designer. So there's a team of people that helps to put a book together. But for the most part, it really is the work and the vision of that one author. Whereas with a movie or a TV series, it's much more of a group effort. There are probably going to be hundreds of people involved in bringing that to the screen. And there's often more than one writer. Like, even as a writer, you're a small piece of that bigger puzzle, and you might not even be the only writer on the project. It's pretty common on a movie for multiple writers to be brought into different drafts. Certainly in TV, it's a very collaborative writing process. They'll hire a staff of writers who sit together in a room and they break out the story for the series. So you have a much smaller role in the overall picture when you're a screenwriter, as opposed to a different type of writer. And what that means is you really have to be sensitive to what your role is, and then do that, and then not try to do everyone else's job for them. So your job primarily as a screenwriter is to create the story, and that's what you're really providing in a screenplay. The story is the number one thing. You're not as much responsible for everything else. So, for instance, in a book, the author might describe what characters are wearing, and that's a good way to kind of tell us something about the characters. It shows you something about the setting and the time and place. It helps the reader to visualize what's going on. But in a script, the only time really that you would describe what a character is wearing is if it's important to the story for some reason that they have to be wearing that particular garment. Otherwise, that's not really your choice as a screenwriter. That's something that the director will have some say in. And then there's also, of course, a whole wardrobe department. And that's what they do, is they figure out what everyone's going to wear. So you don't want to step on their toes. So you kind of stick to, I'm here to provide the story, and you don't really do as much of everything else. So it's very, very story oriented with screenwriting. So if that's something that you enjoy writing, then it's a great fit for you. It's also very structure oriented with movies and TV. Traditionally in TV in particular, where they have commercial breaks, and this obviously with streaming is not always so much the case now, but a TV script will be broken out into an act structure based around where the commercial breaks are. So you have to follow a specific act structure on the page for that purpose. Like, for example, for me, I've been developing a script over the past year with a studio that they're developing for a cable network to be shown as a TV movie. And since there are commercials that they use, they gave me a very specific act structure where they said, like, it has to be this number of minutes, it has to be broken into this number of acts. Each act has to be a certain specific number of minutes. And so I've had to structure the entire story around where the commercial breaks would go. And even if you're not writing something with commercials, most screenwriters will still think in terms of some sort of an act structure when they're writing. They might use a 3-act structure, they might use a 5-act structure. So even if they're not actually explicitly putting the act breaks there on the page, the way that you would for a TV script or for, say, a play that might be shown in the theater, they're probably still thinking in terms of acts. And just in general, it's very kind of structure oriented with screenwriting. And a part of that is because of pacing. There's just not as much time to tell a story in a script as opposed to a book. You know, like when a book gets adapted into a movie, a lot of times people are like, oh, the book was better, the book was better. And I think part of why people feel that way often is things have to get cut. You don't have as much time to tell your story in a screenplay as you do in a novel. So inevitably, there's going to be stuff that doesn't make it onto the screen. And so you have to be really focused when you're writing a screenplay on figuring out what are the essential beats here, what's kind of the important stuff that forms the story, and distilling it down to that. So it helps you to really understand story structure in a very kind of rigorous way. And something that kind of goes along with that is the idea of efficiency and pacing, momentum. That's also something that is really, really key in screenwriting. You have to be concise. Part of why length is so important in a screenplay is because there's a specific formula that people generally follow, that a page of a script is equivalent to about a minute on screen. So people pay very close attention to the length of a script because it tells you how long the finished product is going to be. So if it's a movie, it would fit into a certain length range. If it's an hour-long episode of TV or a half-hour-long episode of TV, the script is going to fit within a fairly narrow range of page numbers that it has to adhere to. Also, people in Hollywood like short scripts, and I feel like that's been the trend over time as things have gotten shorter and shorter. And there are some exceptions, like a lot of the really big tentpole movies these days, like Avatar, Star Wars, Marvel type movies. Some of those are like 2.5 to 3 hours, but that's sort of an exception. Other movies tend to have actually gotten shorter over time. And if you think about your audience of people working in Hollywood who would read a script, they tend to be people who are very busy. They have a lot of reading to do. They have a lot of scripts crossing their desks. So they like it if you make their job easy. They like scripts that are shorter. They'll open up the document and look right away at the number of pages. And if it's long, they're probably going to be like, I don't want to read this. So they like scripts that are shorter. They like a lot of white space on the page. They like something that reads just really easily and seamlessly and they can get through quickly because you're making their job easier. So being efficient is always good on the page. Also, another reason for that is that everything that goes on the screen costs money, which is kind of a mental adjustment to think about if you're used to doing, poetry, short stories, novels, that sort of thing. It's not going to cost much more to print a book if it's a little bit longer. Whereas with a script, everything that goes up there on the screen costs money. It can cost a lot of money. So it pushes you to really think about everything that you're putting into your script. Why is it there? What is it contributing to the overall story? What purpose is it serving? Everything really has to feed into the final result and kind of justify its existence because it's going to cost money. So even if you're writing a book or a story or something, sometimes that's kind of a helpful tool to think about if you're trying to be concise and maybe you want to cut some length is imagine that everything that you're writing there is going to cost money to produce. Is it earning its keep? Is it really serving a purpose to the greater whole? So you have to be very conscious about length and pacing when you're writing a screenplay. So that's a little bit of an overview of kind of what screenwriting looks like as a form of writing and some of the hallmarks of it from a creative sense. So say you're sold on it, you're like, yes, I want to try writing a screenplay. Where do you start? What are some tools that you can use to kind of get your feet wet with screenwriting? So first of all, you're probably going to need a software program. Scripts have a very specific format that they're written in, and I'm not going to go into what that looks like today just because we don't have time, but there's a lot of like everything has to be indented in a certain way. So if you're trying to write a script through just Microsoft Word or some kind of typical basic like word processing program like that, you're probably going to lose your mind. Those programs aren't really friendly for writing a script. You really need like a dedicated screenwriting program. There's one called Final Draft, which is the program that I use, and it's probably the most common one that's out there. And in the handout that it's going to go out, I have some links in there to a few of the best known programs that people tend to use for screenwriting. Most of them are paid. I also have links to a few in there that are free. Some of the free programs will have limitations, like maybe you can only create a certain number of documents, or if you export as a PDF, they put a watermark on it, something like that. So if you're screenwriting professionally, you're doing it long term, you're probably going to want one of the paid programs. But certainly if you're just starting out and want to give it a try, there are programs you could download for free that are very good and usable. Another thing that I would recommend that you do, which, as with any type of writing, you should probably be reading what you're writing. So if you want to write scripts, you should be reading scripts. And luckily, that's pretty easy to do. There's a lot of scripts that are available for free online. So if you just Google the title of whatever it is you're looking for, plus either script or screenplay, there's a good chance you might be able to find it out there somewhere for free. Like say you want to read the script for Titanic. You could Google Titanic screenplay or Titanic script. Sometimes it helps to add a PDF to the end of the search query. So like Titanic script PDF, but there's a good chance you'll be able to find it out there somewhere. There's also a number of sites that have kind of databases of scripts that they've compiled that you can read for free. And I've put links to some of those in the handout as well. So it's just a good way to kind of familiarize yourself with screenplay format and sort of the conventions of what is included in a script, what isn't, how long are scripts, how long are scenes individually, getting used to the formatting. And especially I'd recommend trying to find scripts that are pretty current because screenwriting, like any form of writing, evolves over time. So some of the standards for how things are written can kind of change over time. You can definitely learn about the nuts and bolts of how to tell a story from an older script as well. But it's helpful to read more contemporary scripts just to make sure you're keeping abreast of kind of how things are done in the industry today. Another thing you can do in addition to reading is you can watch movies and TV, but watch them in sort of an analytical way with your writer brain turned on. We're all used to watching stuff just as viewers for entertainment, kind of passively taking it in. But if you push yourself to watch something and really think about it in more of a story analytical sense, like one thing that I've done sometimes is I'll watch a movie and I'll have a notebook there and I'll be like my super screenwriter nerd self and I'll write down like every scene that happens in the movie. So anytime that the location changes or the time changes or both, that's a new scene. So I'll make a list of every scene that happens. And then that basically gives me an outline for the movie. And I can go through that after the fact and really pick it apart and try to think about, okay, what's the act structure here? Where are the act breaks? Is there some kind of midpoint turning point? Is there an inciting incident? What's the climax? Do I like these characters? If so, what do I think makes me like them? Who am I excited to see on screen? What makes those characters compelling to watch? What sorts of tools or tricks are they using to communicate information to the audience? So just really kind of picking apart the things that you're watching in an analytical way can help you to understand how the story works and how they achieve certain effects on screen. And then another thing, and this is something also that is true for any type of writing, is getting feedback is super important, getting notes from other writers. So if you can find and connect with other screenwriters, you can read your work and help give you critiques. That can be really helpful. Other writers are helpful too for giving you notes, but I do find personally my my screenwriter friends and my fiction friends tend to give me very different sorts of notes. So it can be helpful to find people who know screenwriting and are kind of conversant with the form and the conventions of length and that sort of thing, to give you notes on your work as well. And then, so lastly, the last section I kind of wanted to get into is a question that Surabhi had brought up earlier, which is a great question about how do you actually get work as a screenwriter? Say you've written a script, how do you get it out there? How do you try to sell it? Or how do you potentially get hired to write something as a screenwriter? So I will say, first of all, my perspective on this is all from the US and kind of how things work in Hollywood. If you're in another country and working in the film industry there, it might be totally different. So this is kind of how things work over here. The truth is, it's a good question, and it's kind of a hard question to answer about how screenwriters get work or how you can sell a script. It's not really a straightforward linear process. It's not like you can just go on the website for a movie studio and fill out an application and get hired as a screenwriter. Hollywood is a very kind of small and insular industry. It's very competitive. They're not necessarily that open to outsiders. So it really is about who you know. And that's kind of a cliche, but it's true. It's all about networking and making those connections. Some people are lucky and they have nepotism on their side. That's how a lot of people break in, is they have family connections, or they have people from school or something like that that they can kind of pull in those connections. And for a lot of other people, they just kind of try to make the connections on their own. They move out to LA, they get work in the industry, usually starting from the bottom as an intern, which means you're probably not going to be paid. And then you might graduate to an assistant job where you get paid a little bit, still not that much, but you're kind of just working and doing the hustle and trying to meet people and asking anyone you can to read your script, and hoping that somewhere along the way there'll be an agent or a manager who likes your work and wants to represent you, or you might be able to meet with someone from a production company and they like one of your ideas and want to develop it, something like that. So it's not a straightforward thing. There's not like a very clear-cut way to get work as a screenwriter. So that's kind of the honest truth, is it's mostly about connections. And I know that can be kind of disheartening if you aren't somebody who wants to go out and, you know, work full-time in the industry and live in LA and uproot your entire life. But there are other ways that people can potentially break in. There are certainly people who have gotten work as screenwriters without doing that. So I want to talk about some of the other avenues as well that are potentially out there. One thing that can be helpful is contests. There are a lot of screenwriting contests that you can enter. Some of them are very, very well known and prestigious, and really, if you win, it can really move the needle for your career. There are some that aren't quite as prestigious, but that are still legitimate. And then there are some that are just scams, pretty much. And all of them will charge entry fees. All of them will be happy to take your money. So just make sure you're doing your research before you enter a contest and trying to figure out how legitimate it is. Look at the results of people who have won and what it did for them. Not just, did those people end up going on to do something in their careers, but specifically from winning that contest, did they get something out of it that actually helped them in some tangible way? Look at the companies and the people behind the contest. Look at and see if you can find third-party websites talking about it, or people on other websites discussing it and what they have to say about it. I also, in the handout that's going to go out, I have links to a few contests that I know about that are some of the kind of top ones in the industry that are very well respected and that I've heard good things about over the years. Another thing you can look at potentially is screenwriting websites. So there are some different companies and websites out there that are kind of geared towards helping screenwriters who want to break in and are trying to develop their craft and develop their careers. And they'll offer different sorts of services. Some of them will have a place where you can host your script. So you can send your work in and they'll put it up on their website, and they'll have log lines or like short descriptions for all the scripts. And so people who work in the industry who are looking for material to develop can go through there and look and see if there's anything they're interested in and potentially download your script. Some of them will offer evaluations. You can get feedback on your work. Some places offer pitch meetings with producers or help with development. A lot of these companies also have their own screenwriting contests that they run. And again, this is one of those things like the contests where there's a bunch of them out there. Some of them are better than others. They're pretty much all going to charge fees for the different services that they use, or that they offer. So just make sure you're doing your research, and that if you're going to invest in something like that, that it's a good use of your money. And I do have the names of some of those on the handout as well that we'll provide. Another thing you can look at potentially is fellowship programs or kind of writer development programs and workshops. Some of these are associated with festivals, like the Austin Film Festival has a screenwriting program, Sundance Labs. There are some that are associated with film and TV studios, like in TV, there are different programs that are kind of geared towards helping you get a staff writing job on a TV show. So if you get into the program, they'll have workshops and networking mixers and stuff like that. And then the end goal of it is to try to help you get staffed on an actual show with a job. And with most of these programs, you'll probably have to submit 1 or 2 scripts to apply. There might be an application that also has like a personal statement you have to write, something like that. A lot of them have a diversity component. Probably the majority these days have some sort of diversity component. So just make sure that if you are applying to one of those, that you read through all the rules and everything on the website first to understand that what they're looking for and make sure you qualify. But those can be a really good way to get some leverage and break in, even if you don't live in LA or even if you don't have any previous experience in the industry. Another thing that's important is representation. So if you have an agent or a manager who can send your scripts out for you, that's definitely a big leg up. It's a lot easier to send stuff out or to have somebody send stuff out on your behalf as opposed to trying to just do it yourself cold. It's a little bit of a catch-22 because it's hard to get work in the industry without an agent or a manager, but most agents and managers don't want to work with writers who aren't already working. So it's kind of like, how do you break through that and how do you get that first step? But there are some agents and managers who will consider cold queries. It's a little bit more closed off than in publishing. Like in publishing, it tends to be that you can be an outsider who's never published anything, you don't know anyone, and you can send in a cold query. And a lot of agents really will read those and take them seriously. And a lot of novelists get agents that way, and for nonfiction writers as well. That's harder to do in entertainment. They tend to be a little bit more closed off to it. But there are some agents and managers who consider cold queries. So you can definitely try doing that. I would say, once again, do your research, Google is your friend, do some online stalking and research anyone who you're interested in sending things to and find out if they have any interviews online that you can read or anything on their social media that indicates, are they open to cold queries? What do they want those to look like? I will say in general, you probably don't want to send an attachment of a script unless they respond and ask you for the script. So just send your query letter up front. And then if they respond, then you would send them the script. Some people are just wary of getting attachments in general because they don't want viruses and stuff like that. It's also kind of a legal thing. Like some people are concerned that if you send them a script that's about like a Mouse King, and then 10 years from now, their company develops a movie that has a mouse in it, then you might come back and sue them and be like, you stole my Mouse King idea. So they don't want to get sued. So a lot of people are not open to receiving cold submissions for that reason. So just make sure you're kind of trying to follow the rules and find information about anyone you're submitting to. Another thing you can potentially consider doing is producing your own content on a micro budget, which is easier and more possible than ever to do these days. You can get good equipment relatively cheaply. There are actors who live all over the place. There are people who know how to work a camera who live all over the place. Fundraising is easier than ever. There are people who make movies now that are completely crowdfunded off of Kickstarter. There's also equity crowdfunding, which is similar, but the people who give money to your project have a stake in it. So if you make a profit, then they make a profit too. I know somebody who raised all on his own over $1 million through equity crowdfunding, and he wrote a movie and produced it all on his own doing that. So it's possible to do. If you really, really want to get something made, you can try writing a script that's super like small and contained and low budget and raise the funds yourself and make it. It's a lot of work to do that, but it's possible, and more people are doing that than ever. And then the last thing I would say is just know the power of IP, intellectual property. Hollywood loves IP. They love it when something is based on something else. They're a little bit scared of just an idea that's just something that a writer came up with. They like it when they have something else that they can kind of tie it to and show to their boss and say like, well, it's based on this thing, so that's why we should develop this. So they love it if your movie is based on a book, or it's adapted from another movie, or adapted from a TV show, or it's based on a true story. There's an article that they've optioned is based on a board game, whatever it might be. They like it when something is based on something else. So that's actually great news for authors, because if you have a book that you've published, even if you've self-published it, you can potentially think about adapting your own work And then you will have a better shot at getting that screenplay out there and getting interest in it, because you can say that it's based on this piece of IP that you have the rights to. Like, for example, Serby mentioned that I co-host a book podcast. And last week I was interviewing this writer named Iris Yamashita, who I was talking with her about her debut novel, City Under One Roof, which just came out. But she's also a screenwriter. She wrote the screenplay for Letters from Iwo Jima, which she was nominated for an Academy Award for. So she's very, talented and has had a lot of success as a screenwriter. But she mentioned that to me that she had developed this idea for a TV series. And there was some interest, and some companies were kind of looking at it, but it never really went anywhere. And then she took the exact same idea, wrote it as a novel, published it. And so that's the book that just came out. And now that it's out as a novel, all these TV companies are coming back and being like, oh, let's develop this as a series, because now there's a book that it's based on. So it has more kind of clout. So if you have a novel that you've written and published, consider adapting that. And that can potentially give you a leg up with trying to get a script out there. So I'm going to wrap up and open it up for questions. I will mention that I actually am going to be teaching a screenwriting course next month in February, if anyone's interested. It's run through Charlotte Lit, but it's going to be on Zoom, so you can join from anywhere. And it'll be 3 sessions spread out over 3 different nights on 3 different weeks. And we'll get a lot more in depth than I did today into like the formatting of the script and the fundamentals of screenwriting, and start developing story ideas. I'll try to put the link for that in the chat if anyone's interested in registering. But yeah, I'll just say again, like, screenwriting is a lot of fun. It's a good way to stretch your muscles as a writer and can develop some skills that I think are really helpful to translate into other forms of writing as well. I know when I wrote my first novel, I had done some screenwriting prior to that, and I think it gave me a lot of tools that made it easier to write my first book. So give it a try if you're interested. And there are more ways than ever to get your work out there. So it's a pretty good time to be a screenwriter too. So with that, I guess I'll open it up, and if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a lot of information, and everything's been helpful. I do like to take a group picture before we go into the Q&A session. So Josh will take the group photo for us, and whoever is comfortable turning your cameras on, please turn them on. If you can't, it's perfectly all right. Josh, will you give us a count to 3 or something?
Sorry, yeah. All right, 1, 2, 3. All right.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, so if you have any questions, you'll have to put them in the chat, because the format of the program is you can't unmute. So please put them in the chat, and Sarah will answer those questions for you. So Sarah, are you doing the screenwriting for your book has been, you tell us about that experience of doing it for your own story.
Yeah, so my first novel that I got published, The Plus One, it's been optioned for TV, but I haven't really been that involved in the development. Basically, my agent sold the rights, and I had one initial call with the production company that optioned it to talk a little bit about just sort of high-level ideas about how I would see it. But since then, I really haven't heard anything, and that's pretty common. A lot of times, if you're a novelist and your work gets optioned, the novelist is usually not brought on as screenwriter. Sometimes they might be, especially if you're like a bigger name writer. Like I think for Normal People, Sally Rooney's series that was optioned or that was adapted into a Hulu series, I think she wrote that, or at least co-wrote it, I believe. But it's pretty normal that if they option a book that you've written, that they just kind of take it and do whatever they're going to do with it. So I haven't really been involved in that process. But I think if I ever were to kind of try to do a script of it on my own, I like the idea of adapting it for TV as opposed to a feature, just because that gives you a little bit more room to change it. A novel obviously is kind of more similar to a movie in a creative sense in that it's a closed-ended single story, whereas a series gives you a lot more room to play around and change the characters and expand things. So it was kind of fun to actually think about like, okay, if I were to do this as a TV series, what would I do and where would I take the characters and how would I expand it? So I didn't actually get involved in doing that process, but it's an interesting creative exercise, I think, too. So you can also do that if you've written a book. You can think about adapting it as a feature script, or you can think about writing a pilot and what would this look like as a TV series if it has those sorts of legs of the story. And I see some other questions in the chat, so let me start here. Jesse asked, what are some of your all-time favorite movies and shows, and is there anything new that's come out lately you were loving? That's a good question. There's so many great things. I would say my all-time favorite movie is Harold and Maude. I don't know if any of you have seen that. It was a movie that I've seen some thumbs up. It came out, I think, around 1970, and it's kind of a cult classic. It's like a dark comedy, which I love. I love anything that's like humor, but also something dark about it, or also has like some sad parts. And it's one of those movies I think people either love or hate. Like I've talked to people who have watched it and they're like, I just did not get that movie at all. But I think it's really, really well done. It has like some good humor, but it's also really heart touching and affecting in different moments. And it's just kind of off kilter and different in kind of a fun way. So that's my favorite movie of all time. I would say shows that are out right now, White Lotus on HBO, if any of you have watched that. I've been watching the second season of that, and I think it's really well done. It's an ensemble show. The first season was in Hawaii. The second one is in Sicily, and they're both set at different resorts. And it's another one of those things where there's some humor in it, but there's also drama, really good characters. One thing that I think the show is really good about, Mike White, who's the creator who wrote it, he's really good about creating tension and setting up dynamics between the characters where you watch it and you kind of know that something's going to go wrong, but you don't know exactly what. And he's not necessarily setting up these kind of linear binary story questions like, will these people end up together or not? Or will they solve the murder or not? It's a lot more kind of nuanced and gray area stuff than that, but he's really great at developing this sort of building sense of tension, and you don't know where it's going to go. So that's been a really fun one to watch. Larry and Peggy Gale asked, great talk, Sarah, thank you. I was surprised by how specific and detailed the format of a screenplay was. Definitely sounds like it requires dedicated software. Yes, that's true. I know some people who have tried to write scripts in Microsoft Word, and I don't know how they do it. That would drive me crazy. It's definitely, if you're curious, I'm sure you can do like a Google image search for script format or something and see kind of what it looks like, but it's a very specific format. And so it's helpful to have the software to do the basics of that, and also to know kind of the more case-by-case situations come up, like how do you format a phone call, or if you have like an intercut where you're cutting back and forth between two different locations within the same scene, how do you do that sort of thing. So it takes a little bit of time to get used to the format, but it's pretty straightforward. It's not that difficult once you're used to it. iPhone asked, what if we need help writing a query letter? What suggestions do you have? So I wrote query letters when I was getting my my novel agent. So I'm familiar with that process. I've never queried agents or managers in the screenwriting world, so I don't know as much about kind of the way that's done. I would say that one thing that is different between the entertainment industry and the publishing industry in that sense is if you're querying a novel, it's much more about like, I have this one specific novel that I've written, or a nonfiction book, memoir, whatever it might be, that I'm trying to get published. And so you focus, like a query letter for a novelist is going to be mostly about the novel. And then you might have a short paragraph at the end that talks a little bit about yourself and your bio, but that part is pretty brief. It's really more about the story and the book that you're sending out there. It's kind of the opposite in screenwriting, where they're really looking more to sign you as a person and you as a writer, as opposed to like there's this one specific script that you've written that they want to go out with and try to sell. So usually at the point when people are querying an agent or a manager in the screenwriting world, they probably have written multiple screenplays and they can say like, here's my portfolio of work. So you might also have one specific script that you're kind of leading with, but it's helpful to think about how do you pitch yourself as a writer? What kind of things are you bringing to the table? Like what's your overall picture of what it is that you write? Are there awards that you've won or contests that you've placed in, that sort of thing? So you're really pitching yourself as a screenwriter more as opposed to focusing on one project. So that's kind of the biggest difference, I would say. Kathleen asked, are there any resources for children's short poetic stories to be adapted to film? I'm not sure. That would be an interesting thing to look at. I would imagine that it would be helpful to look at children's movies that have been made and how, because it would probably be adapted into something like that. Like I'm trying to think, that book, A Snowy Day or whatever it's called, I think there's a movie version of that, which is kind of a classic children's book. I will say for children's movies in general, it's in animated movies, it's even more kind of closed off. Like it's probably harder to sell a spec script, meaning a script that you just wrote on your own as a writer, if it's a children's movie as opposed to a movie for adults, because that is a smaller marketplace. And especially with animation, like movies that Pixar makes or Disney animation and stuff like that, they really develop all of those in-house. So they start within the studio with an idea and they bring in a writer or a team of writers, and they have, especially Pixar has like their own kind of proprietary system that they use for developing a story. So they're really not taking scripts that other people have written and saying, okay, we're going to buy the script and develop it. It's more about their in-house process. So it's a kind of closed off world to get into, but maybe if you're looking more on the indie circuit, there might be some more opportunities there. So I would look for, if you can find movies that have been developed outside of like those major studios like DreamWorks Animation, Pixar, that kind of thing, or their children's movies based on books, and kind of see how those look like. I think that would be helpful. iPhone said, do you have any screenwriters that you suggest we check out? I think I would say just start by looking at what movies you like and seeing what those people have written. One thing that's different about screenwriting as opposed to publishing is it's a little bit more flexible. Like screenwriters tend to be able to hop between genres a little bit more than novelists because they're not a public facing quantity. Like the author of the book, the name is kind of the brand. Like readers read a Stephen King book and they expect it to be a certain thing, whereas nobody knows who the screenwriter is of a movie. So you have a little bit more flexibility with that anonymity. You don't have to adhere to a certain brand quite as much. So like Mike White, who I just mentioned, who created White Lotus, I think the other thing that he's most known for is School of Rock, the Jack Black movie that came out in like the 2000s or something, which is a very, very different, totally different project than White Lotus, totally different genre and audience. One is a movie, one is a TV show. And so in screenwriting, you tend to see that a little bit more, where people will do sort of disparate work that's kind of different from each other. As far as like writers who I think are great, Phoebe Waller-Bridge is really good. She created Fleabag and Killing Eve. I think she worked on one of the recent Star Wars movies. Taika Waititi, I think, has like a really interesting, quirky style. He's good at balancing comedy and drama. Trying to think of Emerald Fennell wrote Promising Young Woman, which I think was really good. So you can always look for, I would say, like look at movies that you think are well done and find who the writer is and maybe check out some of their work. If you're interested in checking out screenwriters who are sort of on the verge or more up and coming, there's something called the Blacklist, which is a list that comes out every year. And they like to call it like a list of the most liked screenplays in Hollywood as opposed to the best screenplays in Hollywood. And it started out as this very sort of small thing that really did pull people who weren't known and help them get a leg up. Now it's become this sort of like Hollywood has kind of glommed onto it and everyone lobbies for their clients to get on it. So it's pretty much everything that gets on the list these days is now already in development, but it's still a good way to read scripts that are a little bit more original. Like they're not like the big kind of studio movies. They tend to be slightly more interesting, smaller stories, a lot of kind of awards bait type of fare. So if you're interested in looking up the Blacklist, and you can find ways to download a lot of those scripts online for free as well. So those are interesting scripts to look at. Some of them are based on books, but a lot of them are just kind of spec scripts that were ideas that a writer had. So those are interesting to read. Mary asked, how long have you been doing this? Do you love movies? Yes, I do love movies. And that's kind of how I got into this in the first place. As a kid, I loved movies and TV. And it wasn't until I was in high school, I think as a teenager, I started to kind of put it together like, oh, people actually make these things. So that's something that I could do. Like I love writing and I also love watching movies and television, and I could combine those and be a screenwriter. And so I first started dabbling in screenwriting a little bit when I was in high school. And then when I was in college at UNC Chapel Hill, they have a screenwriting minor. So I studied screenwriting there. And then through the school, I got into a program at UNC, which helps to place you in an internship in LA. So that's kind of how I came out there and started working in the industry. So I've been doing it since I was, more seriously since I was in college, I guess I would say. And I also like writing fiction and poetry. So I kind of try to balance between those different areas. And so sometimes I'm more actively doing screenwriting than others, but I've been doing it for years. And yeah, I love it. It's really rewarding. Pam said so much helpful information. So thank you, Pam. I'm glad to see you here. Larry and Peggy asked, some screenplays, even if they diverge significantly from the source novel, turn out very good. This year, The Old Man on FX with Jeff Bridges and John Lithgow comes to mind. Also, The Peripheral by William Gibson, great book, great screenplay, but very different from one another. Those are great recommendations. I haven't seen either of those or read either of those, so I'll definitely look at those. Yeah, and also the subject of like adapting a screenplay from a novel. I do think that most of the time, if you read the book and then you watch the movie or watch the show, usually most people like the book better. Usually I like the book better, but there are some that are very well done. The book, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro is such a good book. And then there was also a movie that was made of it with Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson, which I think won several Academy Awards. And that is a really great example of a movie that was adapted, I think, very well from a book, especially because it's a book that if you had just read it and not seen the movie, I think you would think it would be very challenging to adapt because it's not like some big kind of splashy story. It's much more small and character-based, and it's just about like who these people are and what's going on inside their heads. But they did a really great job adapting it into a movie. So yeah, it can be done. It can be challenging, but it can be done. Manjusha said, great talk, so thank you. And how do you assess your work? When do you know that it's ready? That's a tough question because I feel like I never really feel like it's ready. And this is true for screenwriting or poetry or fiction or whatever it is I'm writing. Like, no matter how many times I read it, I'm always going to find new things that I want to change. So I think at some point you have to just kind of give it up and send your baby out into the world and decide that it's ready because it's going to be ready. Sometimes it helps to set deadlines for yourself, whether it's you want to enter a contest or something, and so you have that deadline of when you have to enter it by. For me, I tend to work in sort of stages when I'm writing something. So I'll write a draft, and once I get to the point where where I feel like there's nothing else that I can do with it now, not that I necessarily think that, oh, it's perfect and there's nothing else that can be done, but I just am stuck and I don't know what else to do to make it better, then I'll try to step away from it for a while and also send it out to some of my beta readers and critique friends to read it. And then that kind of helps me get outside of my own head and know what I can look at changing. And then once I get their notes, then I'm like, oh yeah, I should change all these things. And so I do another draft. And once I've done a few of those, then I can potentially get to a point where I feel like, okay, it's ready to send to someone. But usually for me, it takes a while and a number of drafts before I feel like I'm at that point. And there's always going to be more to change. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like, it's never ready until it just has to be. Like, I think in Saturday Night Live, they have this saying that like they're ready when it's 11 o'clock on Saturday night or whatever time they premiere. Like, that's when the show is ready because it has to be. So I feel like it's that way with writing too. It's, when it's time to publish, that's when it's done. And Larry also said, Peggy and I are in the Write Like You Mean It group with Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, Ed's group, which is a great group. And I know Pam used to host that as well. And several people here are in Write Like You Mean It, which I love. How about dialogue heavy screenwriters? Aaron Sorkin comes to mind. Yeah, he writes a lot of dialogue. And so I think his scripts tend to be a lot longer than the average script. Like that whole 1 page a minute thing I talked about doesn't really apply to Aaron Sorkin. His scripts tend to be a lot longer, but he's well known enough that he can get away with that if you're just trying to break in initially and you turn in a script for a movie and it's like 150 pages, people probably aren't going to like that. But he has such a specific style where it's directed in a way where the dialogue is very like fast paced. And so they're able to do those longer scenes, but have it still play really quickly on screen. I like those sorts of scripts. I tend to like stuff that's very dialogue heavy. It's kind of a taste thing. Some people like movies that are a little bit more focused on the action. I like character stories, so I like stories with a lot of dialogue. But yeah, that's a good one. I'm blanking on the writer's name, but there's the guy who wrote Frances Ha and directed that, Noah Baumbach, I think it is. He has a movie that just came out on Netflix, which I think was also adapted from a book. He's another one who tends to be very dialogue heavy. He does like a lot of long conversational scenes. Some of his movies, I think it works really well. Some of them, like this more recent one on Netflix, I was a little bit like, I don't know if it's not really playing right for me. But yeah, that's definitely like a style choice that I think some people can do really well. Shalona says, are there specific books on how to write or format screenplays that you recommend? What screenwriting tools or software do you recommend? Those are both great questions. And those are actually in the handout that I put together that I think the library is going to send out after this. I have both of some of those in there. As far as books, I think some of the books that I referenced on there are Save the Cat, which is like a classic one for talking about structure. There's also a book called, I think, Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is more geared towards novel writers. But the traditional Save the Cat is more about screenwriting. There's a book called Adventures in the Screen Trade by William Goldman, who, if you want to look at like possibly the best screenwriter of all time or the most kind of lauded screenwriter, William Goldman was kind of it. I mean, he wrote like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, All the President's Men, The Stepford Wives. Like he had a lot of big movies, especially in the 70s and 80s. And he wrote a book called Adventures in the Screen Trade, which is not really as much about the craft of screenwriting, even though it bleeds over into that a little bit. It's more of his experiences. And even though it's kind of dated at this point, it's still a lot of fun to read, and a lot of the kind of underlying themes of what his career was like and lessons he learned are still very relevant. So that's a great one. And then I have a few others that are mentioned in that document as well, if you're interested. And in terms of screenwriting tools or software, so I use Final Draft, which is probably the most commonly used one. There's also a program called Movie Magic. There's one called Celtics. I think it's CELTIX. But again, I'm going to have links to some of those in the document that will go out. But Final Draft is kind of like the standard bearer for the industry. I think that's the one that most people use. But it is paid. So it's one that you have to, if you want to use that one, you have to invest in it. And there are some others that are free if you want to just try those to start out. Mary Pearsall asked, what's your favorite script that you've written? That's hard to say. I guess there's a script that I wrote, I guess I'll say two, which are both two of the more recent scripts that I've written. One is it's based on a true story. It's about this woman named Harriet Jacobs, who was living in North Carolina I think she was born in 1813. And she was born into slavery, and she had a really incredible life story. She ended up, in her attempt to escape from slavery, she spent 7 years living in this little attic kind of alcove in a town in North Carolina. And it was like this little room that was, I think, 7 feet by 9 feet by 3 feet tall. It wasn't even like a real room. And she was there for 7 years by herself. And eventually she did escape, and she went north, and she wrote a book about her life and became an abolitionist and was touring on the speaker circuit with people like Frederick Douglass. And she was just a really amazing person. So her book, which is called, now I'm blanking on the name, but anyway, she wrote a book, which I would highly recommend looking her up, Harriet Jacobs, and reading her book. But I wrote about her, which was the first time I had ever written anything that was inspired by a true story. And I think it was really helpful for me to have that as a backdrop to it, because it made it feel like, okay, this is a story that people need to know about, as opposed to if it's just my idea, I'm kind of like, does anyone care? Is this important? But it was nice to have a true story to work with that I felt like this is really important and compelling material. And that gave me a great basis for it. And then also I wrote a pilot over the past year called Claire, which is an hour-long pilot. So it's a drama, but it has some humor in it as well. And it's about this woman who's living a double life. So she has 2 different families in 2 different cities that don't know about each other. Because I figure like you hear true stories about a lot of men doing that, but you never really hear about women doing that. And I was like, how would this work for a woman to have like 2 husbands and 2 families that she's keeping a secret? And then she also hosts a true crime podcast. So there's a crime story, mystery element to it as well, where she's investigating this mystery, but then people involved in the case find out about her secret and start using it to blackmail her. And so all these parts of her life kind of start coming together. And that's been a fun one to write. It's been a challenge to get the character right, I think, but I like characters who are really kind of complex and have dark sides. So yeah, I think that's been a fun project, and that's one that I'm continuing to revise right now. And so Shalona asked, to learn more about the screenwriting event. Thank you. Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat too. You can register through Charlotte's website. And yeah, and Pam and Shalona mentioned Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Yeah, that's the Harry Jacobs book. Definitely recommend reading her book, and it's widely available. It's you can find it online since it's open source at this point. But yeah, I'll put the link for the screenwriting course in the chat as well if anyone's interested.
Sure. And Shalona, if you have registered through the library, I can make sure it comes in the thank you email as well, so that if anybody wants to join, I can put the link to that program with the group picture and whatever else, the handout that she's talked about. Okay, I mean, questions are popping up. I think you covered a lot, and we are at time to close. So thank you once again, Sarah, so much. This was amazing.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Great questions.
Great questions. Yes. We will be meeting again on February 15th, same time. And my guest is going to be Meredith Ritchie, and she's going to talk about digging into dialogue. So that's it from us. Thank you, everybody, so much. Bye. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.